So thank you all for joining us tonight or this afternoon or morning, depending on where you are. It's a pleasure to welcome Trent Morer of Georgia Southern University this afternoon. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his presentation. So without any further ado, I will now pass on the virtual microphone to Trent.
Thank you so much. Can you still hear me okay? Great. Okay, so I thank you all for muting and for turning off the video to save a little bandwidth. I really do appreciate that. I want to jump right into this. Hopefully those who have been watching the recording figured out the first few minutes were not the presentation. We are now at the presentation now, and we're going to talk about translating SoTL findings to students to affect learning sustainability through knowledge mobilization. And I will begin with, what in the world is that? So let's do a power prediction activity here. What is this session going to be about? What I would like is for everybody to kind of make a prediction here. You don't necessarily have to drop it in the chat, although you are welcome to do so. But I would like to give you 1 minute to just think about some thoughts about what you think this session is going to be about. Make a prediction. And the reason why is that the SoTL and learning science literature is so clear that making predictions, even if we're wrong, helps us to learn more, especially long term. So I want to start at the beginning with everybody make a prediction. What is this session going to be about? And then feel free to drop something in the chat. I'm going to start a timer so I don't end up going too much over the 20 minutes of time that we've got here today. But please drop into the chat your ideas or thoughts about what this session is going to be about. All right, I see Heather has dropped in applying knowledge mobilization KM strategies to teaching. It's good, it's pulled right from the title, right? Bianca said, I think it's about how to use your SoTL research to inform your teaching and how to communicate your research findings to students. All right, that's a great place to start. So let's move on to the only really massively dense slide in the deck. And if you are having trouble viewing the slides, I did upload a copy so you can download that and follow along. It's a simple PDF. We are currently on slide number 3. So our conference theme is talking about using effective SoTL practices to engage, inspire, and equip students to make lasting impacts on their communities. And there was a particular focus on sustainability. And something that an international collaborative writing group through ISSOTL that I was a part of in this last year was working on was how to translate the findings of SoTL research to students as an act of knowledge mobilization. And I have to give credit to my wonderful colleague, Dr. Cherie Wilmer, for introducing me to this idea of knowledge mobilization. That article that's referenced here was published in TLI in March of 21, so you're welcome to track that down. Just real quick as to what knowledge mobilization is. One of the most pithy definitions is from the Social Science and Humanities Research Council in Canada. Sorry for the typo there, that's to be Council in Canada from 2019. It's an umbrella term encompassing a wide range of activities related to the production and use of research results, including knowledge synthesis, dissemination, transfer exchange, and co-creation or co-production by researchers or knowledge users, which is really dense. What it really comes down to is we engage students not only as end users of the information, as in we send them information and say, here's stuff that will help you with your learning, but also in partnership, and here's how it ties into that partnership with students theme, as knowledge brokers, facilitating access to knowledge to others. So not only are they empowered to learn better and more effectively themselves, they are empowered to help others learn better and more effectively. And that's how it ties into the sustainability piece of our conference theme here. They're not just changing their own learning, but they are able to change others. So let's move on to our next slide in the deck. That's slide number 4 for those of you who are following along on the digital copy. I'm sure right now you're thinking, oh, but wait, I am so already overwhelmed with too much to do and too little time with which to do it. How could I possibly do something like this without investing significant additional time and resources? I hear you. And right now, during the pandemic, it seems like we've only had that many more things to do and that much less time to do it. And so as a way of motivating you, you'll notice in the white font at the top, it says motivating. What if I could show you a way? I understand the initial hesitance, but what if there is an easier way? And I think many of you are going to be on board with that motivation. And that brings me to James Lang's book, Small Teaching. And the depiction here is of his first edition. I believe it's currently in the second edition. It was originally published in 2016. I want to do a connecting activity now. So you'll see the text says connecting. I want you just real quick, 1 minute here. What do you know about this work? What do you know about James Lang? What have you read? What have you heard? Because again, the SoTL literature, the learning science literature says when you connect to what you already know about something, it is much easier and more efficient for you to integrate new information and learn it long term. So let's practice that. You can drop in the chat, what do you already know about this work and the author? I'll give you all about 1 minute on that. Okay, I see somebody else, looks like Janice had said, I've also never read it before. It's a good read. It does a really good job referencing the SoTL literature. So I will then say just a few quick things. Lang suggests that there are 9 what he calls categories of small changes that you could make. And his idea is these are little things that you can do that require little time, little effort, but have outsized impact relative to the time invested. That is the whole focus of the book. It is robustly based on the SoTL literature. So there are these 9 small changes that teachers could make with very little time and effort to improve their teaching and learning. So to continue with that motivating piece, what I'm going to show you today is how I reframed my existing learning activities in my introductory family science course using Lang's framework. And I did that to present them to students using a knowledge mobilization perspective designed to empower them to not only help themselves, but to help others to be more efficient and more effective learners. And I really want to stress, I designed no new teaching activities as part of this. I just took what I was already doing in the course as is and reframed it and re-explained to students what I was doing. The amount of effort involved was truly minimal. So we're moving on to our next slide in the deck. This is slide 7. I had mentioned Lang has 9 areas. I listed 8 here because the 9th is expanding, and that's really more about what we're doing right now, professional development and continuing education. So these are the 8, and I actually share this with students early on, the first week of the course. And you'll see up the top it says growing, learning techniques we'll use in the course. Well, if you look on this list, growing is actually number 8. It's one of the 8 strategies I share with students. So he lists these 8 strategies. Very similar to his wording. I actually call prediction the power of prediction. I think that's a little bit snazzier title. But the idea is I go through these 8 different learning strategies with students and I explain, here's what they are. Here is the basic, very, very basic SoTL grounding of them and why they help. And you'll notice earlier in this presentation, some of these I used. I used power of prediction. I used connecting. Part of this. I didn't actually explain the part where I'm talking about, and here's a lot of the SoTL research behind it, although I did very briefly reference it. But I explained to students, this is how I use them. So on the first day, we go through this and the SoTL research that supports them. And then each time we do a learning activity, I identify it, like this is a retrieval practice activity. And as a reminder, even if you don't get this right, the mere act of trying to remember it without looking at your notes just off the top of your head is going to wear that path in your memory a little bit easier, and it's going to be easier to access next time. So every time we do a learning activity, I identify which one of these it is, and I re-explain that research that promotes learning. So let me show you what this looks like in my class. So we're now moving on to slide 8 in the deck. This is an overview of the small teaching lessons I use in my Child and Family Development 1131 Introduction to Family Science course. What you see on the left for the topic is each topic I cover in the course, and some of them it says I'll cover for 2 days or for 3 days. And then there's a column for each of those strategies. The R is for retrieval practice, power of prediction, interleaving, connecting, practicing, self-explaining, motivating, and growing. And you can see there are a lot of these. In the bottom under the total, there are 203 discrete activities that I do in the course. Now, some of them are as simple as a very quick multiple choice retrieval practice question. Others are a much more involved 15 to 30-minute activity applying course concepts. All of these activities were already part of the course. I didn't design any of them for what I'm talking about here. I just took these 200 plus activities and labeled the students what they are and the SoTL research behind why it's important to do them. And you will see on some days, like the Planning and Preparing for Children Day, we only have 3 of these kinds of activities, but there are 5 total activities. Whereas on others, on the Family Science, Studying Marriages and Family Days, there's still 5 activities, but there are 5 different of these activities. There are lots of different ways of doing this. This is just the way I use it in the class as it stands now. So moving on to our next slide, this is slide 9 in the deck. I'm going to give you some examples of how I use these specifically in the course. Now, in order to show a consistent theme, I picked a lot of these that I use from the day we talk about dating, but not all of these are from that. So let's take a look at our first one here. This is slide 10. This is a retrieval practice question. So after we've covered some material in the class on dating scripts and moved on to a different part of the topic, maybe 5 to 10 minutes after we've covered that, I throw up this question. I tell them, this is a retrieval practice question without looking at your notes or talking to anybody else. Just as best you can, off the top of your head, answer this question. Here is the question. There is a correct answer to this. Students vote in using their clickers that I use. I then show the results to the class of how everybody answered. I go over what the correct answer is. That was all part of the class before. The only thing I changed is that I now call this retrieval practice, and I remind students that engaging in retrieval practice makes it easier to learn the material long term. I reference that SoTL literature. So a minimal change takes about 30 to 60 seconds of additional class time to integrate that change. Moving on to slide number 11, this is an example of a power of prediction question. So at the start of the day where we talk about dating, I open with a question. I ask them to predict something about what we're going to learn for the day. So every day they make a prediction that has a factually correct answer, and they find out, do they predict it right or wrong? Moving on to slide 11. This is an interleaving question, which is similar to a retrieval practice question, but it's based on a topic prior to the day we talked about dating. This is from a day that we talked about mate selection. So it's a retrieval practice question, but about material from a prior day. So I'm hearkening back to, hey, we learned this before. Do you still remember it now? And I particularly like to use the same retrieval practice questions again a second or third time as an interleaving question, because students will start to see, hey, being asked this question multiple times, it's easier for me to remember what the correct answer is or what an incorrect answer is. All right, moving on to our next one. This is a much more complicated one. This is slide number 13. This is a dating scripts activity. And you'll notice up at the top, this is a connecting, practicing, and it's an idea where we're trying to have students connect to the material. What is their experience with it? But also specifically practice applying course concepts and then explaining to their peers in small groups and to the class why they think what they think about that connection, about that practicing. So I have them describe a typical first date. You see the details there. And then I want them to apply specific material from the class about what they've learned about gender roles and what gender messages they see in that, and then analyze it from the perspective of instrumental or expressive traits. And so we go through this as a whole class discussion. It's very common that when I do connecting, I will also link it to practicing and explaining, because it lends itself really well to activities where students work in small groups applying course concepts and discussing that material. All right, moving on in our slide deck to slide number 14. Occasionally, I will do some motivating activities, and one of the ways I like to do that, Lang talks about how telling great stories can be a great way of motivating. And I always show these two photos to students just like this. For those of you who don't recognize these individuals, don't feel bad. I have never had a student recognize either of them. This is Alan Turing and Bayard Rustin. They are two of the most important figures in Western 20th century civil rights history, but for different reasons. I tell them a little bit about who these people are, but not their names. I tell them about what their contributions were, like Turing's contribution to the code-breaking effort at Bletchley Park and how that helped win World War II. I tell them about how Bayard Rustin was the organizer of the 1963 Civil Rights March on Washington, D.C., and that he's the one who brought Gandhi's nonviolent protest movements to the civil rights movement and Dr. King. I tell them all that, but not who they are, and I just set it up as a tension loop, and I just kind of leave it there. And then we go through all the material we're going to talk about with prejudice and discrimination and bias. And only then do I loop that back to, and here's why you've never heard about these two people, because both of them happen to be gay men. And that history is left out of our common recollections and tellings. That is a form of marginalization. That is a form of bias. So I then tie back in how it's an illustration of course content that even though you should have heard of them, you didn't. And here is specifically why you've never heard of them. And then I tell them what happened to both of these two men in their lives as a result of that. So that's a way of motivating them. And again, I did all of this already in the class. The only difference was now I call it motivating. And I explain why motivating matters. Additional about 30 to 60 seconds. All right, so moving on to slide 15. This is an example of a growing activity that I do very early on in the class. After we have been going through a significant amount of material, I just tell them, okay, stop. I want you to take 5 minutes to reconstruct your behaviors and jot down your answers to these questions, thinking back on the last 10 minutes, reflecting on your learning. So thinking about what you've done up until this point, what have you learned? How better can we take notes? How better can we think about connecting the material? And at the bottom, you'll notice it references the 6 dimensions of learning. The first week of class, I also teach them the 6 dimensions of learning from D. Fink's taxonomy. And I introduce them to that, and I talk about how this course is a little bit different from many other college courses because we actually will address all 6 of Fink's dimensions of learning. It's one of the things I adore about this class. So I give them time to do this. And I'm seeing that I got the heads up, I've got only a few minutes left, which is perfect timing because now it's your turn. So let's do some connecting and practicing and explaining. This is our Q&A part. This is our open discussion part. I want you to think about how could you adapt this approach to your own teaching and learning context, and which parts of this seem the most promising, which parts seem the least promising, and why. And I listed the 8 again so you could all see those and link back to that. So now we're at the point where there's time for questions, there's time for open discussion on these questions or anything else. Floor is yours.
Since there's only a few of us, it's okay to unmute yourselves and ask the question directly.
Works for me, unless we get any significant feedback. That's really easy. But you're also certainly welcome to use the chat too. But by no means feel pressured to do one or the other.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
I was just, well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation. My brain is sort of full about how I can apply this when I'm learning. I was wondering if you found that students connect particularly well or maybe less well to certain ones of these 8 practices, like if any of them tend to resonate more with your students than others.
That is such a great idea. Let me say first, one really interesting thing about this that suggests to me that the knowledge mobilization approach really is working is that on my end of course student evaluations of teaching, when students write in their open-ended comments, they will actually use this language. And they will say, I love the power of prediction questions. So it has changed the way they frame thinking about their learning. That was entirely unanticipated to me, but it's just blown me away. And I remember talking once with my chair about it. She's like, what are they talking about here? I'm like, oh, so this is a reference to James Lang's work, and she got it. But I would say overall, I don't think their mastery of the 8 is good enough that I could conclusively say, oh, they resonate more with this one rather than that one. I think I also use some of them more frequently than others. Like growing, I don't use as frequently as some of the others. Motivating, I don't use as frequently as some of the others. Whereas retrieval practice, I use that every single class period, typically multiple times. And so because of that frequency, I think they're going to see it more, they're going to remember it more. I have had students explicitly say they find it easier to remember having those retrieval practice questions, that material. And I'm like, well, guess what? That's exactly what the SoTL literature shows. Now let's talk about how you can use that to study. Let's talk about spacing. Let's talk about the practice effect. It's a great kind of segue or leverage into introducing them to more SoTL research. And what I adore about this is our introductory course to the program, to the major, to the field, to the minor, all of that. I get them on board right from the start about here are all these ways you can learn, which they then take to their other classes, to their other majors. It's really, really helpful to use a knowledge mobilization perspective on that. Having said that, I know that didn't really answer your question, but I don't think I've got enough data, even anecdotally, to be able to say they really resonate with this one or that one.
That's okay. I really appreciated your answer. Thank you. And like Natalie said in the chat, that is fascinating about the course evaluations.
Yeah, it really blew me away. I'm trying to tell my colleagues now, and this is why you need to do it too, because could you imagine if all the course evaluations for an entire department, all the students consistently kept using the same language that's grounded in the literature? What other questions do you all have? I think we've got maybe 8 or 9 more minutes left in our time.
Well, this is not so much of a question really, but I teach on the postgraduate certificate in learning and teaching in higher education. So I basically teach students, because to us they are students, but they are actually members of staff. So So there are early career academics who take this course in order to gain a teaching qualification. So they are either new to teaching in higher education, or they're just new to teaching altogether. And I think from what you said and looking at this framework that you're putting forward, I think I could see them resonating with the power of prediction, and with practicing, and what else with number 7, motivating, because you see everything that we do on the course has to have a clear application, if you want, and has to relate directly to their practice. So I think I'm gonna try this and see how it see how it goes next semester.
That's such an interesting point, because I honestly hadn't considered this before, despite how many people I know who work in education and higher ed in that type of situation where they're working with existing teachers, whether it's K-12 or higher ed.
Yeah, there's a duality of there's that duality between being staff and student at the same time. So
But this is perfect, because you can easily say, and if everything we're doing is about what you're already doing, here is the lowest fruit possible way to take what you're already doing and just relabel it. You're repackaging it. I think that is a really interesting opportunity to, again, from a knowledge mobilization perspective, hit people who are going to then immediately put it into practice.
Yeah, no, I think you've given me a great idea here, so I think I'm going to try some of your approaches as soon as possible. See what feedback I get. I'll let you know.
Good.
All right. Well, if there are no other questions, then all we can do is just thank you for your participation, and thank you, Trent, for this lively and very engaging presentation. I really enjoyed it. We have now come to the end of this presentation, so thank you everyone for attending. There is a private messaging system on this platform, so if you want to get in touch with Trent, please do so in the next couple of days. But there's definitely a lot of food for thought in this presentation, so I will be reflecting on this for the next few days. Trent, thank you very much.
Thank you. It's great to see you all and to have a chance to talk with you. I appreciate being such a wonderful audience. Take care. I hope all your other sessions go great too.